the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. I think one of the things that's taken for granted these days is that we live in culturally impoverished times. In our age of AI, technology is taking over culture. And it's not a great time to be a musician, a filmmaker, and it's not a great time for movies or music. I wonder whether my guest today, one of the most iconic music journalists over the last quarter century, Simon Reynolds, would agree. His new book, his first book for I think 8 years, Future Romania, Electronic Dreams, Desiring Machines, and Tomorrow's Music Today, is out. And Simon is joining us from South Pasadena. Simon, are the cultural pessimists these days falling into the same trap that all cultural pessimists fall into, the trap of nostalgia?
Well, I mean, I've been accused of being a cultural pessimist myself because of the previous book that's kind of has a relation with this new one, Retromania, which was, quite a gloomy book and looking at, the overload of retro, regurgitative.
Yeah, and the full title, of course, Retromania, Pop Culture's Addiction to Its Own Past. It didn't do you any harm. It was a very successful book.
Yeah, it certainly, it was a book that was, I suppose, intended to be a talking point, and it did generate quite a lot of talk. I mean, I think, there's a lot of the things that I critique or identify or diagnose in Retromania are still going. And, there's a lot of pastiche and a funny sort of way, the most science fiction-y things technologically have allied with the retro culture. So you have this kind of necro-futurism, if you can forgive me that word.
Oh, I like that one. Maybe you could have called the book
Yeah,
Necromania.
It's too gloomy a word, I think. But I just read about AI being used to recreate or revivify, reanimate the voices of iconic movie stars like Laurence Olivier to do audiobooks. And it's sort of mundane yet creepy. It's sort of somehow like, yes, they would.
But what's wrong with that? I mean, novelists have been doing that for the last few hundred years, recreating the voices of either dead or imagined people. What's wrong with electronic media doing the same thing?
So who did you say, like actors and impressionists have been?
Well, novelists or actors, but novelists have invented, I don't know, Tolstoy invented War and Peace. I think he invented people that and invented their voices. So novelists have been in that business for generations. What's wrong with electronic artists doing the same thing?
Well, it's not really. It's what I'm talking about is like people they sort of use AI to conjure up a very realistic sound of James Dean or Laurence Olivier reading an audiobook. I mean, it's bad for voice actors, who make their living out of doing audiobooks, but it's also, it's kind of creepy because Laurence Olivier doesn't have any say in the matter. Would he want to be reading this book? Would he think it's a cheapening of his thing? I don't know. I think there's a lot of ethical but it's just a kind of weird, that a lot of AI in music is used specifically in music is used to, there was a fake Oasis. And a kind of AI Oasis. I think it was spelled AIasis, like AI. And it's sort of like a kind of poor imitation of Oasis, created almost entirely using AI. And a lot of AI is being used in this, retro way, this sort of recycling way. But there are creative artists doing interesting things with it as well. Like quite fairly obscure electronic artists who just done really interesting things with it, much more eerie, unsettling things with it. So and I've known musicians who say it's actually quite a useful tool. You can speak a beat. You can use your mouth to create a beat, and the software will turn that into.
Is it, Simon? And this has been said about many waves of new technology, especially internet technology, that it's democratizing, that it allows anyone now to become a musician.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's that initial wave, like I think when, say, drum machines or samplers were first invented, you get a lot of inspired amateurs who don't know how to drum, or don't, kind of aren't conventional musicians, but they seize the technology and do something really unexpected and sort of unorthodox with it. And it gives them a jump start over the musicians who've trained for years, the professional musicians. If you look back in our music papers, there are, the musicians' unions tried to ban synthesizers at one point, and so there's always this sort of thing of the upstarts grabbing the new technology and doing something with it. In the book, in Futuromania, I have a long essay on auto-tune, which was reviled initially as sort of like cheating, like it's people who can't sing, or people who can't, who aren't can't stay in pitch, cheating. But what actually happened, as it evolved, is people learned to use it as a kind of weird distortion technique, and kind of actually did things that were never intended with the machine, as so often happens. There's this famous William Gibson quote. He says that, the street finds its own use for things. And with auto-tune, really in rap particularly, and other sort of street dance musics, people found all kinds of things to do with auto-tune that had never been intended by the manufacturer.
Yeah, I thought you were going to give me the most famous, I think, almost perhaps overused of the Gibson quotes, that the future's already arrived. It's just unevenly distributed.
There's about 4 or 5, aren't there? Great.
He's the Winston Churchill of the digital age. Whatever wisdom is there, Gibson thought of it before anyone else.
That's right.
Simon, what's your? This is probably a bit of a stupid question, but is the history of art one of sort of perpetual Luddism, where everyone's reacting against previous technologies, both in business terms and in intellectual terms?
I don't know about that. I know that, there's a long tradition of hand-wringing about new developments with almost every new entertainment form, when it comes along, is sort of, people are like, this is it. This is the death of culture. This is the death of literacy. This is the death of Western civilization. And letting in, it's just the inane or degraded kind of form of entertainment. And then, the reaction to rock and roll when it first came along was largely on the lines of, this is absolute garbage music and degrading the youth. Then it goes to this phase where it actually reveals its own kind of sophistication. It may not be a sophistication that can be translated into the existing high cultural terms, but there's its own sophistication. Rock lyrics work in a different way to the novel. Rapping works in a different way to rock lyrics. So there's always been someone complaining that this is the ruination of musicianship or literacy or cultural standards, and then eventually the good stuff comes through. There are people who say that about games. I probably did not. I was one of the last generations never to get into games, but people say there's amazing experiences to be had playing games, and it's really, become like a cultural form. I wouldn't be able to say. So I think every kind of juvenile, trashy, technologically assisted form of culture tends to have its decriers and its naysayers initially.
An old friend of the show, Jonathan Taplin, also a friend of mine, he was Bob Dylan's original tour manager, and I think, perhaps he would acknowledge this, we did a show with him recently on this, is nostalgic for the culture of the 60s, the rock and roll music of the 60s. And he made it quite clear in a recent conversation that he doesn't think that modern music, certainly 21st century music, can compete, or modern musicians can compete with the creativity of the greats of the 60s. Do you agree?
No, I don't agree. I mean, there's a lot of garbage, but there always has been garbage. If you go back to the '60s and actually look at the charts, I mean, there's there's amazing things, Pink Floyd and the Beatles or whatever. But there's always like been kind of tons of soppy, maudlin ballads and just throwaway stuff. Like same with like the '80s when there was all this exciting sort of synth pop and post-punk music, but there was an average top episode of a pop program on TV had a lot of kind of very just blandly professional or middle of the road stuff in there as well, and throwaway novelty songs, particularly in the UK where we both grew up. There's tradition of the novelty tune, the comedians doing a record,
or sports teams, football teams.
The football team. So there's always been this sort of in Germany, I think it's called Schlager, isn't it? Like Schlager music, this sort of middle of the road music. So there's always been guys, but I think there are people doing creative things in all kinds of music. There's a kind of, in recent years, there's been this what they call speak sing, which is like people, mostly British bands, where it's not really singing, they're kind of chanting, or it's almost like kind of white middle class form of rapping, and with great acerbic lyrics, and the music is often very interesting and trying to be experimental. It hasn't taken over the charts, but groups like Dry Cleaning have, and I can't remember the other ones.
The charts even matter though anymore, Simon? You're a dedicated blogger. You used to be a mainstream journalist. You still write, but has the importance of the charts in today's fragmented cultural world, has that gone away?
Yeah, I don't think it matters as much. I don't think my own kids are very into music. When I grew up, when the new chart was announced every week, you'd be glued to the radio, and
it was a big deal.
Yeah,
it was like a football team or something. You were watching your artist up and down the charts, and you celebrated, or
and so like for me in the '80s, I would be like, I'd be very crushed when the Smith single would go in and then drop down the next week, and actually Morrissey when he was a teenager or a child would make his own version of the chart with all six top singles being by T-Rex, his favorite artist. So there is this thing of like very invested in how well your bands are doing and who's number one and all that. I don't think my kids and their generation care or even know they are interested in streams, like they know like the number of streams certain artists have. That's and that's something you might, if you were a young music journalist, you might sort of pitching an idea, you might say it's already racked up 10 million streams or whatever. So things like Spotify and so forth are a metric of how well things are doing. YouTube hits as well, but I don't think the charts. I mean, I don't know. I don't think anyone, because I don't know what's in the charts right now. I have no idea what's number one in the UK
And that's ironic, given our data-driven economy. What about the role of technology? I didn't seem as if it was particularly important one way or the other in the '60s. Punk, which became the reaction against big rock and roll, was almost anti-tech. How was the role of technology? We'll get to Futuromania and today's AI-infused music in a second. But how is technology and one's attitude, the creative, artistic attitude to technology, how do you think that has infused the history of popular music over the last 50 years?
It's always been a very important part. I mean, you just think of things like the jukebox and the role that had with rock and roll, the transistor radio, the fact you could have like a little portable radio that you could take pop music with you everywhere, or you could put it under your coverlet, under your bedspread and listen at night secretly. In the '60s, pirate radio was something that was very important with, the BBC was barely playing any pop music. So these pirate radio stations.
Radio Caroline.
Yeah. And then in the rave scene that I was so involved in the '90s, pirate radio had a second golden age where it was very much part of it. I think, at every stage of music, even with punk, yeah, there was a bit of a Luddite thing, as you said, but things like fanzines were enabled by the sudden emergence of cheap photocopying. So there's always a sort of technological substrat, if you excuse my terminology, a kind of support, I think. So maybe even not even consciously registered by people at the time. There's something that's enabling the new sounds. In the 60s, a whole load of new guitar effects came along that people like Hendrix used, and there was the studio went from 2-track to 4-track to 8-track, enabling this much more sophisticated music that was kind of created largely in the studio and was like sound you lost yourself in. There's always something going on with the sort of tools that make music or distribute music, or that we consume music through, that affects how the culture is working, I think. So
what do you make of the revival, if that's the right word, of vinyl? You probably in some ways covered this in Retromania, your book about pop culture's addiction to its own past. Yeah. Do you see the revival of vinyl as being a reflection of pop culture's addiction to its own past?
I don't know, because a lot of people buy current artists on vinyl and they prefer the format. It's a kind of a mixed thing. I've resisted the bug myself of buying things on vinyl again. I just don't see the point. It's so much easier to use streaming. It sounds good now.
People want difficult stuff, though. It's like the slow food movement. If it's about ease, you obviously wouldn't collect vinyl, but people enjoy the inconvenience, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and in a weird sort of way, vinyl has become this artisanal thing. Like, I was very struck a few years ago when I was in Whole Foods, Pasadena, and I was like, not far from where all the fancy soaps were and the, butter and cheese, was a rack of incredibly, to me, expensive vinyl. Like, I couldn't believe the price. $30-$40 for this vinyl. It seemed to be being sold as this sort of informed consumer gourmet sort of option. But I always think there's something suspect. I think there's a dirty secret with this vinyl thing, which is that most vinyl comes with download codes. And I suspect that in practice, most people secretly, they like having the vinyl, they like the big cover, and it looks nice, they have it in their living room. I suspect practically in their day-to-day living, they're actually listening to it digitally on their phone a lot of the time. But
it's another trick, another clever sell by entrepreneurs.
I think there are young people who really they like getting their first turntable and they buy records.
But they tend to also buy cheap turntables. So
yeah, it's not an audiophile thing, I don't think, on the whole.
I mean, there is the audiophile element of vinyl. What about music as a kind of reflection of what's happening in the world? We were talking about this before we went live. You're in Pasadena, I'm in San Francisco. Increasingly feudal places of a hyper wealthy elite, an underclass, and not a lot in between, the disappearance of the middle. Is that reflected perhaps in some ways in the revival of vinyl, that wealthy people can afford $40 digital downloads essentially, and nobody else can? And we see the disappearance of the middle, which was a feature certainly of the glory years, if that's the right description of rock and roll. And now the music world reflects the inequities of our 2020 age.
Yeah, I mean, I think vinyl was once the most democratic medium, and then until cassettes took over, which became even more like what kids bought. They were cheaper and easier to use, and you played on a little boombox. But vinyl, kids would in the 60s would have like little dance set record players, and you'd pile up your singles, 6 or 7 on top of each other, and they drop down and play. And it was like, it wasn't audiophile, but it was a democratic form. Now it's very much an elite gourmet format, I think, and I should imagine most working class regular folks, if they listen to music, it's probably through streaming, and because it's essentially free that way. It's like a personalized radio. So yeah, it's funny the journey that vinyl has made from being a very sort of mass market, teenage oriented thing, especially with the form of the 7-inch single, to this sort of high end product, a sort of an index of hipster consumerism.
Yeah, which of course adds to the irony of our supposedly advanced technological age. We're talking with Simon Reynolds, very distinguished music writer, much published, is the author of a new book, Futuromania, Electronic Dreams, Desiring Machines and Tomorrow's Music Today. In the second part of the show, I want to get to that. I want him to talk about this Futuromania world, what kind of art we have, and what electronic dreams exist in the music of today. But I want to thank our friends at Liberties, an excellent new quarterly of politics and culture, which help us bring great guests like Simon Reynolds. We're going to show a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Simon to talk about Futuromania. Don't go away, anyone. We are about to get into the future.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We are speaking with the great Simon Reynolds, author of Futuromania. Simon, let's get into the new book. What is tomorrow's music, in your view? What is it made up of? Is it essentially AI?
Well, that would seem to be the cutting edge and what's going to actually change music. As of now, apart from a few very interesting sort of experimental artists like Holly Herndon and Patton and Devitt, it's the interesting work's going on in a long way from the Billboard Top 100, but a lot of AI at the moment is being used in this very kind of recycling, regurgitative, retro kind of way. It's very much sort of in the tradition of the mashup. I don't remember if you remember that. It was a kind of big craze in the noughties where you combine two existing records into a sort of chimera, I think is quite the right word, like a head of a dog on the body of a horse kind of thing. And that was a big craze, and loads of people could do it. It's easy to do, and some people did it quite provocatively or interestingly, combining incongruous things. This is a lot of AI use is in that tradition of kind of digital malarkey. It's sort of it's sort of part of this meme culture, TikTok culture, of sort of parodies and collages of mad cultural crap thrown together. Very sort of puerile culture, really. So at the moment, it hasn't really shown much. At the moment, we can't really hear what the new thing that it's doing is, but I think people will find it, because always with every new sort of form of music technology, there is some kind of secret power in it that, or kind of signature, I think, a sort of sonic signature that, becomes the hallmark of an era. I think it's also it's a practical tool for musicians to use that has all kinds of applications.
What is an electronic dream? Of course, it reminds one of the famous book about sheep and electronic sheep.
Oh, yes.
And our increasing inability to distinguish between humans and machines. But what for you is an electronic dream?
Well, the actual echo I was thinking of was there was a song called Electric Dreams that was like Phil Oakey from Human League collaborating with Giorgio Moroder. So, and the Human League in my book.
And Giorgio is in it too. I mean, you start with him.
Yeah. So I think what I'm trying to talk about in this book, it's a collection of writings done over various years, is music that when you hear it initially, it's like blows your mind, or you feel like, oh, this is a glimpse of the future. So future music, like what's going to be hugely popular, in decades to come, but like mass music, normal music, but also it has some kind of aura or suggestion of how the world is going to be. Sort of get a hit of futurity from it. And that's what, with I Feel Love, that's probably the first time in my lifetime as a person growing up getting into music that I felt like, whoa, this is like nothing I've ever heard, and it does sound futuristic. And it sounded futuristic because it felt like there was no human hands involved in the making of it. It felt like the machines were making the music, which is an illusion.
When did that come out? When did you first hear it?
I was 77, so I would have been 14 then, I think. And it was like #1 for 4 weeks in the UK. Big, huge hit in America, top 10. It was a worldwide hit. And it was the first track that had a real kind of...
And this was Donna Summer, right?
Donna Summer did the vocals. Giorgio Moroder and a guy called Pete Bellotti did the sound with a sort of team of musicians and technicians. It has this mechanistic, metronomic, incredibly propulsive, strobing sort of rhythm track. Then Donna Summer creates this wonderful, airy, ethereal vocal where she seems like she's sort of, when she did it on stage, she kind of did these sort of android kind of movements, So the whole thing is, the conception of it, Giorgio Moroder's conception was, I want to make a song from the future.
Tell us a little bit more about Giorgio Moroder. I mean, you know this stuff inside out, Simon, but not everyone will. Well, why is this guy so important? He's an Italian composer. I mean, he's what? He's 80 years old now, still alive.
Yeah, he was grew up in the Tyrol, which is this area in the north of Italy that's sort of, at one point it's part of Austria. It's got its own language. It's this funny, strange place. He went to Munich and he formed this record production team, and they made a series of, a bit like the Motown of the late 70s, like a huge number of hits, disco, sort of very sexy disco classics. But
they're very Italian. I mean, they're very popular in Italy, less so in the UK or the US, right?
No, actually, globally successful. Eventually they moved to LA. By the late 70s they were in LA, and they were like having hits, producing loads of different people. Donna Summer was their big star. He did movie soundtracks like Midnight Express and loads of different films. He was actually into science fiction. He as his own project, he infamously or controversially, let's say, took Metropolis by Fritz Lang, the great science fiction film of the 1920s, and he colorized it. I think he colorized it. Anyway, he kind of he sort of salvaged it and released it again, but with a kind of rock soundtrack, which didn't really fit with it. He would have been nicer if he'd done like an electronic one that's, like the productions he did with Donna Summer. A very innovative guy. I actually went round to this piece. I went round to his apartment in Westwood in Hollywood, and it was a fantastic experience. It looked like the Mr. Music kind of apartment. He had a big white piano, and he had Grammys and Oscars because he won Academy Awards, I think, for some of the soundtracks.
I mean, does that stuff you mentioned Donna Summer? Not everyone would have imagined that Donna Summer is tomorrow's music today or yesterday. But does that stuff, if you listen now, if you hadn't heard it before, would it sound different, radical?
Well, it's difficult because often innovative records then get widely copied and their innovations get normalized. And all these synth pop groups like the Human League were influenced by it. A lot of techno and trance and house music. So in a sense, yes, it's become normalized and it now seems of an era. But I feel like with these genuine breakthrough records, when you hear them, they still seem futuristic. It's a kind of weird paradox where something that was a breakthrough, it's sort of frozen in time. But it's the same in the way, if you go and look at Guernica, or you look at, a Dadaist painting, or anything that was innovative in its time. If you listen to Hendrix, doing his amazing stuff with his guitar, it doesn't sound dated because it was a breakthrough at that time. Somehow that feeling it gives off becomes eternalized, I think. I don't know, what do you think? I mean, do you feel like things get dated?
Well, I just saw recently a documentary on Donna Summer. It's an interesting, I can't remember the name of the film, but it was interesting. I don't think I think she was in some ways ambivalent or uncomfortable with some of the work she was producing. I don't think she even let her kids listen to it because of its sexualized nature.
Well, she did this Love to Love You Baby track, which was 17 minutes long and has a lot of panting and moaning in it.
Yeah.
And was designed, the record guy, the guy who ran her record company, actually pitched it as like a bawling record. You know, it's just bawling, very dated term for sex. We're gonna bawl, you know, that's like that really, no one would use that term now, but you know, he called it a bawling record. And he actually asked them to make it longer so that it took up the whole side of one album. And so it was better.
That was Giorgio or somebody else?
It was someone, Neil Bogart, who ran Casablanca Records, which was a huge disco label in the 70s. So she did, a lot of her did have this, what I call pornotopian aspect, like it was an audio erotica.
Yeah, I like that one. Another to go with necrofuturism, pornotopia.
I got tons of these terms. But yeah, she did become a born again Christian, and she was like sort of did
not a balling against Christian, Simon, I hope.
A what?
Not a balling again, Christian.
No, she kind of recanted a lot of what she did, and you know, she'd been really embraced and loved by the gay club scene. I mean,
yeah, she's an iconic figure. Yeah, it's interesting what you say. So you're suggesting that certain pieces of work, when they're really radical, they're almost frozen in time so that they retain their shocking radical quality, like
I think so.
Some of Picasso's work.
A lot of great art. You know, I think even with literature, you know, I read Flaubert's Madame Bovary, which, you know, kind of invented the modern realist novel. You think that, you know, because that's what much of the novels of the 20th century were. You think it would seem very tame, but actually, I was reading it. I could feel why it was such a shocking breakthrough there. It was unusually sexually explicit for its time. I don't know when that was, 1863 or something. So, you know, I think anything that's you know, a lot of things that we think of classic were innovative in their time. You know, Shakespeare was innovative, you know, and somehow, I don't think it's just projection. I think there's something that's caught in these works that lasts. I don't know. I hope so anyway.
What about other electronic artists? I know you write about Ryuichi Sakamoto, another iconic figure who died actually last year. What is it about Sakamoto that makes him so interesting in terms of tomorrow's music today?
Well, he made he did a lot of great music. He made a record called B2 Unit in, I think it was 1980. He actually made, and that actually does still sound like ahead of its time, like the rhythms and the strange smears of symphony. And he did a great record with David Seal from Japan called Bamboo Music, and then there was another track called Bamboo Houses. Similar kind of thing that, you know, it's a sort of futurism. It's a sort of East Asian futurism. You know, like when you listen to it, some of the textures make you think of like a futuristic version of a bamboo flute, or they have a certain quality that makes you think of calligraphy or origami, all these sort of things that East Asian culture, Japanese culture, but it's electronicized. And there are Ryuichi Sakamoto and his band Yellow Magic Orchestra are part of this cultural moment that's a bit forgotten now, which is when Japan seems to be taking over the world, like certainly in technology and consumer technology. You know, it was running everything from arcade games to, you know, the sampler and you know.
Yeah, are we seeing much? I mean, the new Japan, for better or worse, is China. Are we seeing a lot of innovation in terms of electronic music and AI? Because China is a leader now in AI in some ways, perhaps more advanced than the US. Are we seeing much in China coming out? Interesting work, interesting art and music?
I've not heard much myself, but I think there's an interesting music scene in China, and I see a little bit of it because I teach at Cal Arts, and some of my music students are from China, and when I ask them to bring things in they think are radical or interesting, they bring in stuff that seems very heavily influenced by post-punk, which, you know, strangely clearly is relevant in China now, you know. So that's interesting to me. I wrote a whole book on post-punk called Rip It Up and Start Again, it was about a period of where modernism and innovation and futurism were very much what people in
Postpunk, 1978 to 1984.
So it's interesting.
Seems a long time ago now, Simon. Yeah,
it is a long time ago. But the funny thing is, I suppose, for whatever reason in China, those kind of groups, Gang of Four and Wire and Joy Division or whatever, kind of speak to something in the culture there. Young people find it inspiring.
Yeah, and the music perhaps less so in the US or the UK or in Western Europe. But we did a show last year with a historian focusing on the role of post-punk in North Africa and the Middle East, and it's much more powerful, certainly more political there than probably it is in the West.
I think there's a funny thing, you know, it's sort of maybe one of the positive sides of the things I was talking about in Retromania, which is this sort of incredible archival culture where everything's sort of available, and you get this effect of atemporality where to young people, post-punk or shoegaze music from the 90s or, you know, Ruchi Sakamoto, it just feels present, you know, present time to them because they're discovering it in the present.
So you use this word atemporality, which means the sort of disappearance of time. What does that mean for the future? Is it Gibson's idea that we're always living in the future, or is it your idea that we're always living in the past? Or is it just the past, the future, and the present always happening simultaneously, this surreal time?
I think the third of those things you said is where the consciousness of young people is, where I see this with young music fans that I come across, and also some of my students, where they pick a mix from all across music history. It's all equally now to them. They don't have a very strong sense of chronology, of historical chronology. They don't necessarily have, you know, I think one student said something like Bob Dylan was influenced by Joni Mitchell, which I don't think is the case. If anything, the other way around. You know, they don't necessarily know the sequence of things went in, but they are passionately interested in certain things they discover, and they might know a lot about an artist.
And that obviously affects the form of the music, because if you don't have a sense of historical sequencing, then the form itself is perhaps without sequencing, which makes it interesting.
Yeah, things that you wouldn't necessarily combine get mushed together, and maybe new sort of hybrids come out of it and mutations. So that's sort of one of the exciting elements of.
Do you think that I mean, we think of the great 60s artist Dylan, for example, whose whole narrative in his work was this shift from acoustic to electronic, or the Beatles, who self-styled their own narrative of going from innocence to something else. Do you think that contemporary artists also have a sense of their own narrative, or in this time, this what you call an atemporal moment where everything is equally now, does that affect their sense of the creative process and their own stories?
Well, it actually, interestingly, what you bring up there is interesting. I think in terms of, like, say, the biggest star in the world now, which I think is clearly Taylor Swift, is here's a whole thing about eras. She talks about a particular cycle of an album and a look she had and a tour as an era, and this is a term young people use. They're talking about eras. They have a sort of sense of their own. That was my something era, or, you know, when I was wearing those clothes and into that was my, you know, whatever era. It's a funny sort of periodizing self-conception. In Taylor Swift's case, you know, she's done these tours, I think, where she's reactivated different eras and of her career trajectory. It's very much like a sort of David Bowie sort of view of yourself, where each, you know, you go through these different personas, and you know, David Bowie, each tour and each album had a different kind of look.
He got it more than anyone, Bowie, didn't he? I mean, he was the most always ahead, one step ahead of everybody else somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the Beatles to some extent had that because they kept jumping and evolving so fast in the 60s. But Bowie made it a self-conscious aesthetic strategy. And I think that's become quite widely adopted by music artists, that they have this feeling they can completely reinvent themselves with every
Yeah, it's very American, the idea. And Bowie was all-knowing, but also a bit shy. Let's end with a few more examples of electronic dreams, desiring machines, and tomorrow's music today. Your new book has stuff about Board of Canada, Burial, even stuff on Daft Punk. Where should people go, Simon, to listen to tomorrow's music today?
It's probably hatching in some corner of TikTok, I suspect. My son
There are so many corners of TikTok, though, they'd be lost.
Yes, that's
TikTok
true.
is a sort of infinite corners.
Yeah. The corner metaphor probably doesn't work. Yeah, I mean, I think my son actually is a music journalist, bizarrely, and Kieran.
Why did you say bizarrely?
Well, because we didn't, it's a bit like when, in the old Middle Ages when a baker would have a baker as a son. Yeah. And so I didn't steer in that direction, but he's very much like following.
I hope he's getting paid.
Oh yeah, he's doing all right, I think. But his whole world is following these sort of meme-driven micro genres that are on the internet and on TikTok, and there's a lot of strange mashing together of things. Things that I was into in the 90s come back, but kind of like jungle music comes back in a weird way that's sort of like people just doing it in their bedrooms and making little videos to go with it, and everything's sort of mushed together, and it's very DIY, and people can make quite huge sounding records just on their phone now. So I think there's all kinds of strange or monstrosities probably are being hatched on the internet. A lot of these things I find hard to actually hear myself. Just my ears can't tolerate them. But I think the kids are all right. Probably is
yeah. I mean, you remain, Simon, cautiously. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Cautiously optimistic about our cultural moment. There's still a lot of creativity. There's, like every generation, there are innovative kids doing great stuff. And the it's not just the kids that are okay, the culture's okay.
Well, I mean, I think that, I think if you were to say like things like TikTok eroding attention spans and making it harder for people to read a book, I would probably agree. And as I write books for a living, that's a source of anxiety. But I think there's, human ingenuity, human mischief, human cleverness is always going to exist. I'm terribly depressed about everything else going on in the world, politically, ecologically, you name it. But like in terms of like culture, I think there's always going to be people doing weird, bizarre things, interesting things, and expressing themselves emotionally as well, and their feelings about the world they live in through music. So in that sense, of course, I am cautiously optimistic.
And a recommendation, Simon. One, I mean, everyone should, of course, pick up your new book, Futuromania, Electronic Dreams, Desiring Machines, and Tomorrow's Music Today. Books about music are always, of course, in a sense, ironic. It needs a soundtrack. What would you like people to be listening to when they read your book?
Well, there is a soundtrack actually in the book on Spotify, a Futuromania playlist. I think probably, listen to some of the interesting stuff being done with AI. This artist Patton did a record called Mirage FM that's kind of interesting, kind of beautiful, kind of strange. Another one called Debit did a record called The Long Count that is actually using AI to try and work out what the instruments, the horns and pipes used in the Mayan civilization in, I don't know, the 10th century or whatever, what they might have sounded like. That's pretty clever, pretty weird, and the record is kind of haunting and sort of futuristic yet atavistic at the same time. So beautiful yet unsettling. So there's loads of interesting, odd records being made.
Well, the world isn't really atemporal, Simon Reynolds. You've been on the show before, you're on it now, and I hope you'll be on it again in the future. You're a man who sees around corners and into corners in our culture. So I appreciate it, and congratulations on the new book, Futuromania by Simon Reynolds, Electronic Dreams, Desiring Machines, and Tomorrow's Music Today. A real honor, Simon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. Enjoyed chatting.